Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for Bloomreach's Commerce Pulse Quarterly Roundtable. My name is Michelle, and I will be hosting our event today. I'm joined by my colleague, Jean, who will be helping me to share today's data with you all, as well as Rich Berkman, Global Leader of Digital Commerce at IBM iX, as well as Brian Walker, Chief Strategy Officer here at Bloomreach.
Good morning, everyone.
For those of you who are joining us here for the first time, and I realized this morning, I think we have now officially done one full year of Commerce Pulse events, so big milestone. Commerce Pulse is a quarterly event that highlights data we gather here at Bloomreach, where we power digital commerce experiences for hundreds of brands and retailers around the world. From our data, we're able to glean insight into the state of commerce today and into what we can expect in the future. And with the help of our panelists, we're able to put those numbers into context. Today, we will specifically be looking at data from the month of June, our most recent full month, as well as data from the summer quarter, so April through June. We'll break that down into 4 sections: a general overview, a look into a few B2C sectors, a brief look into B2B, and then, as always, we will end with some forward-looking predictions for e-commerce. So, to kick things off, I will stop talking and turn it over to Jean, who will share some of the key data points about the overall trends we have seen this past quarter. Jean?
Thank you, Michelle. Looking at the overview e-commerce results of June year over year, so June 2022 versus June 2021, we can see that the North American traffic was down, whereas sales went up for about 4%. The conversion rate was up to about 6% when the average order size only increased about 5%. Now, looking at UK and EU numbers, we can see that traffic was significantly up for just about 13%, whereas sales only increased of about 1%. In the other end, we can see that conversion rate was significantly down for more than 20%, and the average order size increased about more than 12%. If we look at the same data quarter over quarter, so Q2 2022 versus Q1 2022.
It's actually Q2 2022, I believe, right? Just to clarify.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, my bad.
No worries.
We can see that the traffic in North America was down by almost 11%, whereas sales went up for just about 5%. The conversion rate increased about 10%, and the average order size increased about the same 10%. Looking at United Kingdom and EU numbers, we can see the traffic was also down, a slight decrease of 2%, and sales were also down about 8%. We can see that the conversion rates were also down of about 15%, whereas the average order size knew an increase of 7%. Now, looking months over months, May over June, we can see that North American sales in June were down for about 12% compared to May. And in the UK and EU, we can see that there has been an increase, but a very slight increase of less than 1% in June as compared to May. Looking at early numbers of July 2022 over July 2021, we can see that North American sales were up, whereas the traffic was down. Looking at UK and EU sales, we can see that they were down, whereas the traffic was up. So back to you, Michelle.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jean. Brian, let's start with you. Maybe you want to set the scene for us. What do we see this quarter in e-commerce? And then also, if we can zoom out a little bit more, how is it doing relative to the overall economy?
Yeah, really interesting to see what I would sort of characterize as some fairly lumpy numbers. If you kind of look at, the month of June, you look at early July, you look at the quarter, you kind of need to kind of like look and see that there's quite a little bit of variability in some of those numbers. I think, let's zoom out a little bit though and just kind of focus on the quarter-over-quarter numbers. So Q2 2022 versus Q2 2021. And there, I think in North America versus the UK and Europe, we can see some pretty fundamental differences in sort of the economic situations. While in the US, right, and in North America, we see that consumer confidence is at essentially an all-time low. And there's a lot of sort of poor economic news that a lot of consumers are kind of tuned into, right? And that the media tends to focus on. Falling equity prices, of course, rising inflation, and a lot of concerns about, the economy. And yet the average consumer continues to do fairly well in the mid to upper income levels, whereas lower income consumers, are struggling more so, and in part feeling the after effects, right, post stimulus from the pandemic. So they may have used pandemic stimulus to pay off some debts and take care of some necessities. Those funds are probably exhausted at this point. So overall, we see that the North American results have kind of held steady. We've seen a slight decrease in traffic online, but sales have held up for the most part. Now that we need to also put into context with inflation and the reality that most retail prices have gone up, and depending on the segment and the sector, it's probably between 5 and say 15% increases in pricing. Now that's also combined with a higher degree of discounting than we've seen in some time, as many retailers are actually over inventoried, right? Kind of the supply chain challenges in North America have almost swung the other way for many retailers. And of course, there's been a lot of conversations in the marketplace about certain retailers who sort of doubled down on pandemic trends and have been caught a little short now, maybe with a poor inventory mix. We also see that consumers, and I think we'll get into that in some of the segment data, are spending money, but they're spending money in certain segments and kind of pulling away from others. And that's reflected in our ability to get outside, go to events, travel. Weddings are kind of at an all-time high right now, for example. Whereas, spending on your home may start to kind of moderate, right? Or we see it in categories like general merchandise, which may serve a different sort of lower income demographic. So we see that kind of choppiness as well. Now in Europe, I think it's very different. Again, consumer confidence is quite low. Inflation is of serious concern. In the UK, for example, they're dealing with all-time high inflation right now. A lot of political uncertainty as well in the UK. And in Europe, of course, they're dealing with more directly the impacts of the Ukraine Russian war, with energy prices significantly higher, commodity prices significantly higher, and a lot of concern again about inflation and what's going to happen, in addition to a more pronounced lingering effect of the supply chain challenges. And we could even see that in some of the conversion rate metrics, kind of reflected in the European and UK data, where consumers are looking for product they clearly can't find, in part because of lack of supply. So we see a very kind of lumpy set of results there, but I think we have to put into context all of these different factors that are impacting the consumer and impacting retailers, and certainly the macroeconomic uncertainty right now, and the fact that many are feeling kind of under pressure and a lot of concern for their households and for their personal income or sense of net worth, right? It's having an impact in the e-commerce results. Now, you asked another question, Michelle, which is put it into context with overall retail. We don't have June retail results yet in, but if you look back at the May overall retail numbers, they were very, modest growth in categories not related to auto or gasoline and so forth, where we could see some of these impacts of energy pricing and so forth. And so when we put it into context with overall retail, and again, kind of factoring in inflation, e-commerce continues to grow in relation to overall retail. And so we have to keep that in mind, right? I think there's a lot of people saying, oh, the e-commerce boom is over. Well, no, I think the e-commerce boom has moderated and slowed to more of a pre-pandemic growth rate. But we need to be careful not to read too much into the numbers. We got kind of addicted to these massive growth numbers during the pandemic. We need to put that into context as well.
Yeah, great points, great background. Thank you. Rich, considering all this that Brian has given and just sort of what we've seen this first half of 2022, and also, what businesses were expecting to see going into 2022, have you seen any notable changes in how businesses were approaching their digital strategies?
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle. And Brian, I think you hit some really solid points there on the overall look at the economy and what the numbers say, as well as practical sort of thoughts for everyone. The most notable changes in approach to their digital strategies is I would categorize as threefold. One, that commerce and the customer experience are being recognized as the future of business. And in turn, companies are taking a far more strategic view of their commerce initiatives. Commerce is no longer the buy button, but infused across the end-to-end customer experience. And now all commerce is digital and must deliver that seamless omni-channel experience that many businesses have recognized. And to Brian's points around sort of investing and where people were seeing that big boom, there was a big shift that was taking place because there was a lot of pressure going on at the time relative to thinking about commerce more strategically. Second, we've seen a clear shift to modernization to support the growth of the digital commerce initiatives, right? And this means activating the entire commerce ecosystem, which requires both a focus on experience architecture and activating data to fuel their omni-channel experiences. And then three, businesses are looking to serve their customers by optimizing and driving efficiencies across their business and leveraging commerce to drive cost savings through automation, while also identifying growth opportunities through expanding business models.
That all makes sense. Rich, if I may, I think those are really, really good points, and we see very similar within our customer engagements. I'd love to kind of just actually zoom out a little bit. I know you were just in Europe, having some travels over there. What did you kind of sense and observe from your time in Europe, coming, of course, from an American perspective?
That's a very good question. I think what I observed more than anything was that people are out more and about. And I don't know if that's just from it being summer and warmer, but people are out and maybe less at their computers and sitting home transacting on commerce as much digitally as they are getting out into the marketplace. The marketplaces were full. People were out in full force, and not a lot of masks either is what I noticed in particular. But that to me said a lot about people wanting to get out, and as human beings, we want to be social. We want to see other people. And there as we talked about, digital commerce is end to end now. As I was transacting in shops and stores, I use this thing more than ever before for contactless payments. Digital has entered the realm of everyone from the small market in the marketplace shop owner who's like a more mom and pop, pulling out all the wonderful wares that they have from their shops and putting them onto the streets. And I was able to transact quite frequently from a digital perspective in those stores.
Makes me want to head to Europe just hearing you talk about it, which I actually will.
It was lovely to get out from behind the desk and actually interacting with other human beings. That was a good thing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, seems like there will be some damage to our wallets once we get over there. So we only shared a very, very small amount of data about the first 10 days of July compared to that same period in 2021. But Brian and Rich, I just wanted to touch on that and see if you had any thoughts there. I mean, is there anything we should be taking from those numbers, or is it really too early to be inferring anything from that data? Brian, maybe you can.
I'm going to bring up that data real quick here on my screen while I speak to it, because I want to make sure I'm reflecting that data. Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into it. I think again you can see North American traffic down modestly, down 5% in the first 10 days of July, but sales up 3.5%. So again, we see, yes, people are spending maybe a little less time on the digital channels transacting. They're probably still doing a tremendous amount of research online. We can see that reflected in things like conversion rate. And certainly inflation, in a sense, is kind of buoying up the holding up the overall sales number in North America. EU sales down modestly. I wouldn't read too much into that year over year, first 10 days of the month. But they are down modestly, down 2%. And then the traffic, though, is interesting to see it up pretty significantly those first 10 days year over year, up almost 13%. So again, I would say there's some probably issues around product availability that are kind of reflected in some of those numbers in Europe. So I'd say it's pretty consistent in my view so far with what I shared around Q2. I wouldn't read too much into those first 10 days and say there's a strong signal there, but I'd say so far the pattern seems to be kind of holding that we saw in Q2.
Brian, when you think about things from last year to this year, I don't know if there's any reflection on or impact of the numbers from June as an example relative, and especially think about this in the US a little bit more, but it was interesting to see the traffic down but sales numbers up in some of those spots. And I wondered, in the US we had two major holidays bookending the month, right? And then Juneteenth in the middle there as well, and a lot of vacations happening, including myself, right? And how that, if has any reflection, is there a trend or something that we normally see sort of a dip as you've been doing this a few years, relative to what that looks like when you hit, the start of the third quarter, the end of the second into the third quarter?
I think actually we'll see it when we get into some of the category numbers. That I think the holidays, the events, weddings, travel, leisure travel, I should say, is in a sense impacting the distribution across different categories. So we see luxury, which I think we'll get into here in a little bit, having a very strong quarter, very strong results relative to the pandemic timeframe. So even though people can, go to stores or they can travel and shop during their travels, and obviously there are places in the world people travel to specifically to shop. But you're more likely to want to buy a great outfit or buy a pair of luxury shoes or a watch or whatnot if you're A, giving it as a gift, or B, wanting to look fresh and your best, right? And so we see that in the distribution kind of across the categories. I think the reality is those various holidays and so forth are going to be impacting overall retail as well, not just online. And we need to, again, recognize that, while we're kind of counting the cash register in a way with these metrics that we're talking about here on Commerce Pulse Quarterly, we need to also understand the role of digital in all those transactions, which you kind of reflected on both in terms of payments, but also research and discovery and so on. So I'd say, the impact of the reopening and the enthusiasm I think every consumer feels for getting out and about, seeing people again, maybe against the better wisdom of some of our healthcare experts out there. The reality is everyone sort of feels like they're over it and is willing to do that and also, spend their dollars kind of accordingly. And at the same time, even though equity markets are down, we've had the crypto implosion, so to speak, and housing prices are starting to moderate in a sense and so on. Higher income consumers, they're actually spending aggressively in a sense, right? They are spending money, and you see that in the higher value categories, and businesses that are catering to them doing quite well, although they may have other markets like China where they aren't doing quite as well. So, on balance, maybe they're not, reaping it in, but certainly in the US market and in Europe for that matter, those categories continue to do really well. So I think to your question, Rich, I think it's about the categories people are spending in. And then we see categories I think we'll speak to a little bit later again, like grocery, that remain very steady. And we haven't really seen a significant shift down from kind of the pandemic growth in a sense. So we've kind of reached a new steady plateau in categories like that. So it's kind of an interesting, kind of matrix of factors that are, I think, playing out in the numbers.
Makes sense.
A wonderful segue and preview into our next section. I think now we'll move over to B2C and dig into some of these categories that Brian has mentioned here. So, Sean, you want to take us through that data, please?
Yes, Michelle, with pleasure. Looking at B2C e-commerce data, we're just going to start with apparel. We see that sales for apparel were significantly up year over year in June, and even more in Q2 versus Q1 of the year. Traffic for apparel was up year over year, but down in Q2. And the conversion rates were up year over year in June, and more significantly even in Q2 for about 12%. The average order size of apparel was up significantly of about 10% year over year in June, and less slightly of about 3% in Q2. When we look at grocery, we can see that sales were up year over year in June and in Q2 versus Q1 of 2022. Traffic was also up year over year in June, and a bit less increase in Q2 over Q1. We see that conversion rates were down of about 5% year over year in June, but only of about 1% in Q2. And the average order size was down a little bit of less than 1% year over year in June, but significantly up in Q2 over Q1 of about 13%. Looking at luxury data, we see that sales for luxury were significantly up in June and in Q2 for 50%. Traffic also an increase year over year in June and in Q2 of about 20%. The conversion rates also were up year over year in June and in Q2. And the average order size was down of about 4% year over year in June, but significantly up in Q2 of about 14%. Last but not least, home furnishing and home improvement. Looking at home furnishing, we see that sales were slightly down in Q2, whereas traffic was more significantly down for more than 30% in Q2. The conversion rates in the other end was up in Q2 for more than 20%, and the average order size also was up for about 20% in Q2. Looking at home improvement, we see that sales and traffic were down in Q2 of about 29%, whereas the conversion rate was also down, but less, around 3% down in Q2. And the average order size in the other end was really up this Q2 with an increase of about 24%. Back to you.
All right. Thank you, John. A lot of data there, but let's start with grocery. I think that just continues to be an interesting story. Brian, can you start us off with some insight into what those numbers are telling us about grocery and about consumer sentiment there?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking a lot about people getting out and about and kind of like yearning for that, but that's more around social occasions and kind of entertainment and, so on. And I think we need to recognize that in the day-to-day life of most consumers, they we've been reading a lot of articles, right, about work from home, for example, and certainly white collar workers kind of resisting the call back to the office. And we see that in a sense also reflected in commute data. For example, around London, a city that is built on the concept of rail commuting and subway or tube, I guess they say, commuting, into the city center. That is off significantly still from pre-pandemic levels. I think, it's 50 to 60% off in terms of rail commuting traffic on a typical weekday in London. So you can imagine, those consumers are not commuting and back and forth from the office. And so the pre-pandemic routines for how they might pick up groceries and foods are kind of disrupted. In the US market, car commutes are down, 10 to 15%. And while you may still be shuttling kids to school and back and things like that, the commutes to work and so forth are down pretty significantly. And of course, the routines that many consumers developed during the pandemic, which led to like a sense of convenience, such as online grocery and grocery delivery, remain. And in a sense, those were chores that many consumers, fulfilled for like their day-to-day needs. They may still go to the store or the farmer's market and things like that when they're looking to cook something more special. But for the day-to-day commodities and things that they want for their day-to-day lives, online grocery remains like a new convenience for them. And I think that's really reflected in those numbers. So that's I think another important thing for everyone who's running an e-commerce business or involved in B2C to really think about is how your business, adapts to the new consumer habits and how they're living their lives. And I think in these grocery numbers, we can sort of see that. So my expectation is we'll continue to see grocery continue to grow moderately post-pandemic in a sense. And of course, if the pandemic resurges, we'll probably see a return to some more significant growth rates, in that segment.
So Rich, then kind of jumping off of that, I think Brian alluded to this. What does this actually mean for grocery businesses? How are they, or how do they need to be adapting their digital strategies, with all of this consumer habits and consumer preference changes in mind?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. While everyone talks about customer experience, we've identified 3 core experience drivers that are required to deliver a great customer or commerce experience: trust, relevance, and convenience. And within those core drivers, we go deeper to understand how they relate to from an industry perspective. So for groceries, adaptation of their digital experience, we've identified 10 specific drivers relevant to their initiatives going forward, thinking about this data and how it might impact them: price, health, convenience, scheduling, omni-channel, retention, engagement, sustainability, consistency, and search and recommendations. I'll highlight just 3 of those that I think are important to people based on some of the comments Brian made, as well as sort of the data. Let's just start with price, right? As consumers are clearly concerned with grocery inflation growing, Brian, something I forgot to mention was right in that June timeframe in the US was when they raised the 3/4 of a point, right, on the rates. And that drove a lot of this inflation growing to be the highest that it's been in 10 years. And consumers have become more focused on shopping for best value to stretch their dollars. And I think that goes top to bottom, relative to people. And price is the single most pertinent factor affecting grocery shoppers' merchant choices that they make. And according to payments.com, which I was looking at the other day, 56% of consumers would be interested in a grocery subscription if it provided prices that were lower, right? So the action that merchants can take, our grocers, is to offset inflation with cost savings from automation and increased efficiency throughout the commerce ecosystem. Retention would be the next one that I think about, because only 42% of online grocery shoppers have said that experience saves them time, mainly because the user experience is not intuitive and frictionless. So if the first experience was time consuming and inconvenient, or I'm not getting the right selection of things when it's delivered, you know, the actions that the merchants can take, again, ensuring inventory visibility, order insight, buy online and pick up at the store, and delivery scheduling capabilities can deliver that optimal customer experience. And lastly, I'll just highlight search and recommendations. Consumers are increasingly value the ability to search for products quickly and build their baskets while shopping online with personalized product recommendations, learning from the past, taking my last order, applying that, making some adjustments. And as many as 80% of US consumers say they want personalization from their merchants, from their retailers. And I think grocers can get a lot out of this by activating AI and personalization throughout that commerce journey so that they can deliver those more personalized, smart search and product recommendations.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think personalization as it relates to grocery, I know we tend to talk about personalization as it relates to retail, but grocery and food is something that we are all highly specific about. And it's an area where I think personalization is highly important. This is great. I do want to switch us over to retail because I know we have quite a few people joining us from the retail sector today. So Rich, if you don't mind, we'll stick with you for a second. What stands out to you when you look back at these past few months in retail e-commerce?
Competing in an omni-channel world, we all know that the competitor is one click away, right? And that's why we need to go back to focus on those three core drivers I had mentioned around trust, relevance, and convenience. As a reminder, this is very contextual, right? So it means that retailers need to continue to focus on building this trust with their customers and their buyers. And we think about the supply chain, and trust comes into play. Customers want to know what they're getting, where it was sourced, and when they're going to get it, which equals transparency. So there's a distinct focus on things like track and trace, source information, and delivery insights. So even as we were just talking about groceries, extending that to other categories is the same. I want to know, and consumers are more increasingly wanting to know from a sustainability standpoint, from a health standpoint, where are my goods coming from, right? And I want some of those insights. Companies need to stay relevant by leveraging this personalization we just talked about, which means leveraging data to know your customers well. And this translates into making the customer experience convenient for their own customers, right? Expectations from customers are at an all-time high. And that means providing them with options for where, when, and how I want to transact across those channels. And the level of complexity is the reason why it's critical for companies to be using a modern architecture throughout that whole customer experience, because they need to be able to react dynamically. And what stands out to me is that retailers are finally understanding that they need to focus on really leveraging their data while adapting to their technology ecosystem. And that will allow them to differentiate and fulfill the promise of delivering a great customer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, anything to add to that, or anything else that you think retailers need to be considering based on some of the data we've seen from the quarter?
Well, I think, one interesting thing I think is true is that consumers have also kind of become accustomed to some sense that the supply chain is really a big problem. And it's actually decreased the amount of comparison shopping that a typical consumer does. And the consumer used to use the online channels pretty regularly to price check and look for value. Not every consumer, clearly, but quite a few would. And that behavior has decreased. And we see that kind of reflected, for example, I think in some of the North American conversion rate numbers as well. And so I think that's another interesting factor. I would not encourage retailers to create a false sense of scarcity, but it is kind of interesting to see that. Also, I think retailers and brands need to recognize that all the principles that Rich talked about are really important, especially in the context of rising customer acquisition costs, and focusing on your experience and focusing on like the relationship the customer has created with you, and making sure you're delivering sort of relevance and respect back to the consumer, which means marketing in the right way, marketing in a way that pays attention to what the consumer wants and is saving them time, but also bringing things that are relevant to them that they may be interested in. And especially true even in more high consideration purchase categories as well, where helping me pair what I already bought with other product that makes me even look sharper, for example. Things like that are important. And I don't mean just like product recommendations that are based on collaborative filtering that don't have a direct relevance to me, but really getting a more intimate understanding of the consumer, back to Rich's point about data and leveraging that data in a constructive way, and having consumers opt into that and participate in that. And, it doesn't have to be creepy in the background. It can actually be more overt and based on first party data that the consumer, or zero party data that the consumer is willingly providing you. And I think if you really focus on those fundamentals and principles, not only is that a more sustainable model for your business, but it's also, in a sense, building long-term trust with the consumer, who's actually, I think, in a new pattern now. Many different retailers and brands were tried by consumers during the pandemic, in part because of scarcity and because they were leveraging online channels and they were discovering new products, because of all the time they were spending on social media and what have you. And they were trying a lot of new brands. And in a sense, there was a disruption in the loyalty paradigms that a lot of brands and retailers were accustomed to. And that threw things into a bit of chaos, in a sense, for the retailers to recognize that their value and purpose was really being changed and disrupted. And many consumers were going direct to brands. Now we're in a new kind of normal, so to speak. Now is the time to really focus on retaining those customers, activating those customers, and being relevant to them. And so that extends into how you're marketing, as well as the experiences you're delivering on your sites and apps. And in a sense, that's a good thing. And in the context of our new kind of evolving privacy and data security kind of mindsets in the market. And of course, Europe has been far ahead of the US in this mindset for a while, but now we see that also starting to become a more global phenomenon, in part because of the large tech players starting to enforce that for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into now. That also changes a lot of this, and most importantly has really changed how marketers need to be thinking about the combination of acquisition and retention and building a more sustainable model, especially with customer acquisition costs going through the roof.
Yeah, all really good points. And on that note of something that I think is top of mind for a lot in the retail sector, I want to make sure we touch on inventory and returns before we skip out of retail, because I know this has really been everywhere within the retail media. Rich, do you have any thoughts on how retailers should be thinking about those challenges with inventory and returns as it relates to their e-commerce strategies?
Yeah, indeed. And I think it's important to consider the fact that returns from online purchases are significantly higher than in-store purchases, which may sound common sense, but is worth stating, because returns may vary by retailer and category, but it's easily 2 to 3 times in-store purchases. So not only is there a significant cost stemming from the processing and warehousing of returns, but also in an increased implication for both sustainability and carbon footprints, which is also, as we mentioned earlier, become very important to the consumer, as well as to merchants. So decreasing returns is dependent on ensuring customer confidence in their purchases themselves. A key area of focus for retailers should be on making sure their customers are well informed as they move through the buying cycle, right? We're making hundreds of decisions as you're thinking about a purchase, and that being informed, leveraging insights that you have, and providing capabilities that give the customer that informed sense of confidence in their purchase is key. So as an example, think about how augmented reality is used to ensure that a piece of furniture will fit into the space that you want it in your home, right? And you need to know, is it kid friendly? Does it come with fabric protection? And finally, are you going to get it when you need it or want it? Providing customers with the confidence that they'll receive that furniture in the time that they need it is key. And as you can imagine, the return on a piece of furniture is a significant cost that many retailers and, more importantly, customers would like to avoid. And the same thing would go for apparel, home improvement, and other categories. By adding context and insight to support an informed purchase, retailers build that confidence with their customers and will reduce returns, decrease their costs, and continue to build trust with their consumers.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. We have so much more to get through. I just wanted to ask Brian, we did also highlight some luxury, some home improvements, some home furnishings data. Before we move out of B2C, is there anything that was of note to you in any of those categories that you want to touch on?
Well, I think we already talked about luxury, I think, a fair bit. So I think, I probably touched on that earlier, and I think it's very interesting to see that category doing so well. Now, recognizing that during the pandemic, it went through a pretty significant trough as well, as no one had any occasions or reasons to necessarily buy luxury goods unless it was just shopper therapy. Which is fine. But now, of course, the surge, I think, is very much related to social occasions, cultural events, right? All of those things, as well as gifting connected to kind of the post-pandemic wedding and travel, leisure travel surge that we see happening. So I think that's clearly reflected in the luxury data, as well as the fact, as I said before, that higher income consumers actually are continuing to spend significantly, even though their personal wealth may have taken a bit of a ding compared to pre-pandemic levels. They're doing quite well, right? So they're spending accordingly. I think home furnishings, we see it's not down significantly, but it is down modestly. And I think this is partly due to some challenges in the assortments. Again, many home furnishings businesses kind of over-rotated a bit to work from home and so forth. And once you've bought a desk or a new desk chair, you probably don't need one anytime real soon. And people did spend significantly on setting up their homes for work or setting their homes up their homes to provide better, homeschooling or better outdoor furniture, you name it, right? And that was definitely a significant trend early on in the pandemic or mid-pandemic, where we saw home furnishings up in the 150% year over year type ranges. And now we see it kind of moderating, right? And I think also connected to lack of people moving now that home prices and so forth have kind of gotten to the point where they are, and interest rates are impacting the housing market. All of those things kind of play a role in the home furnishings category. And I think we see that reflected there. And then lastly, home improvement, I think, is also connected to sort of the stalling in a way of the housing market a bit. And then also, recognizing that is a category that people use online to do a lot of research, but may still feel the urge to make that trip to a home improvement store and so on. That doesn't mean the digital channels aren't important or that product discovery and all these other things aren't important, but it may be a little shift in the pattern of consumption and purchasing. But it's also important to put those e-commerce numbers in home improvement into context. Again, we saw a massive jump in online home improvement. Again, 150, 200% some months. We saw that up year over year during the pandemic in terms of online business. Now we see that it's moderating a bit, and home improvement as an overall category in retail is also seeing a pretty significant decline. again, connected to things like lumber and commodity prices and other things too. So we just got to put it all into context. So that's how I would sort of interpret and read those numbers, and make sure you're really thinking about it in terms of kind of where we were pre-pandemic, where we are now, and how some of these other factors in the economy and so forth, as well as customer experience, are impacting how consumers purchase in those categories.
Yeah. Interesting to see how those categories have fluctuated over the past year so that we've been doing this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let us switch out of B2C so we can quickly touch on some B2B trends before we hit our time limit. So Jean, you want to take us through the data there?
Yes, with pleasure. So looking at B2B e-commerce data, we can see that sales were down year over year in June, but still pretty significantly up in Q2 versus Q1 of 2022. Looking at traffic, we see an increase year over year in June of 20% and even a higher one increase of more than 30% in Q2, whereas the conversion rates were down both year over year in June and in Q2. And when we look at the average order size, we can see that it was down year over year in June, but the increase was slightly less in Q2 over Q1. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Jean. Okay, Brian, can you talk us through what we're seeing in B2B this quarter?
Well, I wish I had like a very clear narrative there, but I think it's a little hard to say, well, average order size is down 5 points, conversion rate's down, traffic is way up, sales are up, if we look at the quarter. But, B2B category clearly is also driven by the offline economy. This is institutions, this is events, this is restaurants, and of course it's manufacturing and supplies for small to medium-sized businesses largely that are driving the numbers. So, because of the reopening in a sense of the economy, if we look back and annualize these numbers, that's what I think what's driving overall sales. I think the conversion rate number, I'd have to again sort of point to probably some mismatch in terms of products and availability of commodities and other supplies that businesses are looking for. And that's most likely impacting the conversion rates. I think the reality is that if you're a business owner, you were already looking to leverage the online channels just for efficiency. If you're in a business somewhere working to kind of make sure your organization has all the supplies it needs to run and operate, you're already using the online channels, right? But certainly now that it's kind of pandemic, post-pandemic, that's even more true than it was before. And of course, what's driving the demand is going to be consumption of all of the supplies, raw materials, and things you need as a business. And that's what's driving the B2B number. So I think this is kind of connected again to the overall reopening of the economy and health of the economy. And I think the reason why we see the sales results climbing is again, events, travel, institutions reopening, and small businesses now, needing all of those different supplies and so forth that they need to run and operate, maintain machines, maintain facilities, support the customer experience that they're delivering. That's what I think is reflected in the B2B numbers.
Yeah. So, Rich, maybe given some of these trends and some of the, outside factors that Brian's alluding to, are you expecting to see any shifts in technology investments or priorities in the back half of the year?
Yeah, so I think Brian covered a lot of good points there on the numbers and sort of the realities of the past few years have further accelerated the need for robust digital commerce capabilities for B2B enterprises. Both the pandemic and changes in the profile of the B2B buyer have changed, right? And B2B buyers, like B2C, expect choice and a great B2C-like experience. Shrinking margins, the supply chain issues have only exacerbated the challenges that B2B companies face. So yes, there's no question that technology investments and priorities for B2B have shifted around effectively digitizing and transforming their business. And they're taking many lessons and approaches from successful B2C companies. The B2B buyer journey need to be completely rethought and redesigned. To elaborate a bit more, the technology comes back to experience-led modernization efforts and having an architecture that allows companies to respond to market and customer dynamics very quickly. I mean, Brian highlighted sort of some of the challenges and the dynamics that they're dealing with. And if I don't have the ability to respond to those changes, I'm gonna suffer a bit. So in addition, improving the employee experience and engagement by automating low value tasks and freeing employees to focus on more complex value add B2B buying activities and relationship building activities, I think is a big focus. And our other clients have increased their efforts around back order rationalization, smart fulfillment, inventory optimization. We're also frequently asked to support our clients' priorities on business model expansion so that they could develop new product categories, new services, and launch new channels.
Thank you for that. All great insights, both of you. I appreciate your B2B background.
If I may, Michelle, I would just like to build on what Rich was just sharing there. I know we're running short on time, but I think it's really important if you're a B2B company to recognize that what Rich was sharing there is really kind of deep in the B2B mindset. B2B e-commerce started as an order entry form, sort of replacing, the contact center or replacing the fax machine. But that's no longer going to suffice, right? Obviously, even if you send them a catalog, no one's going to be looking at it. And unless it's really a technical, high value, high negotiation kind of product that the customer is looking to acquire, they probably don't even want to interact with a person. So this needs to be supporting a research journey, a product selection journey, giving them all of the detail that they need to buy with confidence, and again, be as frictionless as possible for that B2B buyer, whether it's a small business person trying to buy something that they need for their business operations, or it's a large institutional buyer that's buying in large volume. They're going to gravitate, and their expectations are time, save me time. Like this is work I'm doing here. And by the way, it's not fun necessarily for me to complete all these tasks I need, but make sure it's efficient and make sure I have the information I need to buy with confidence. And again, be as frictionless as possible, because if there's hassles, whether it's payments or whether it's order statuses or it's fulfillment details and all invoicing, all these things, then I'm just going to go somewhere else because this is just too much of a hassle. So you really need to take those principles and apply them. And while it may not be just like a B2C experience, it's the principles behind what you would use to design a B2C experience you need to apply in B2B, and really think about the customer journey in that mindset of what are they trying to accomplish and do, and be the best experience for them. It's not just about price, right? Price is always going to be important in B2B as well, but it has to be focused on experience. And again, people tried a lot of other distributors, a lot of other brands during the pandemic out of necessity at one point. And again, one click away and they can be off and running. And the old paradigms around loyalty because, they like working with us, that's not really true anymore. In terms of the personalities and the salesperson who likes to take a buyer golfing, that doesn't work anymore, right? You need to really think about the online customer experience and the changing nature of the demographic of the buyer as well in that context.
Thank you for that added insight. We have went through a lot of great data today about this past quarter and the first half of the year. And as important as it is to reflect back on what we've seen, I think everyone here is also very eager to hear about what is ahead for e-commerce. So with our last few minutes here, I'd love to wrap up with some predictions. Rich, we'll start with you as our guest. As you look ahead at the second half of the year, what are you seeing for e-commerce, whether in terms of performance or technology strategy, whatever area you would like to comment on? What are you seeing for the months ahead?
Thanks, Michelle. And great follow on there, Brian, on the B2B side. Couldn't agree with all you anymore. So looking forward, second half. As part of an organization's digital transformation, commerce must be a key focus. As we've said before, if you don't get commerce right, you'll be out of business. So what I see for commerce in the second half and beyond, really, are that companies should and will focus on putting the customer buyer at the center of their commerce initiatives and the journeys that they're creating. And regardless of the economic pressures, companies are going to have to accelerate and continue to invest in their digital commerce capabilities. And one of the key considerations will be how quickly they can bring these new business models, experiences, and capabilities to reality for both their survival and their growth. Just keep it brief, knowing we're short on time.
That was great. Thank you, Rich. Brian, what about you? What are you seeing for the months ahead?
Well, it just feels like the news cycle and what's happening in the market and what kind of consumers are going to getting hit with just doesn't seem to really end. And I think the bad news sort of cycle is going to continue to really make consumers feel cautious. We see that very much reflected in the numbers already. I think in certain markets like Europe, that may be even more pronounced right now, but I think we'll also see that playing out in the US. We don't know, obviously, what some of the policy changes and other things may actually be, but it's highly likely that the Federal Reserve in the United States or the European Central Bank in Europe and so on are going to raise interest rates again, with this mindset that appears to be like tap the brakes hard, slow the economy quickly, and then use the tools that they used previously to juice it back up if necessary to get growth going again. That's going to impact consumers in a lot of different ways. Most importantly, mindset, from a retail perspective. So I think that it's likely we'll see that kind of milieu continue, so to speak, out there. Meanwhile, I think we'll see, continued spending in categories that relate to kind of getting out and about and looking sharp, even though return to work may be continuing to be kind of reflecting the pandemic trends and changes in our societies. I think back to school will probably be a pretty good time period, although it appears that retailers may be struggling with their inventory mixes in categories like apparel. So I think we're going to see, again, a pretty lumpy quarter this summer. And I do think people are going to be out and about, vacations and leisure travel. It's interesting, even with much higher gasoline prices, even if you normalize for inflation, people are actually buying more gas right now. But they're not buying it to get to work and back. They're buying it to go on road trips, right? A classic American, but also European tradition for summer vacations. And so we'll see that happening. And again, there's a lot of pent up demand for that, coming out of the pandemic time period where people felt cautious. Now they're throwing that caution aside, even if there still remains some concern about COVID. So, I'm not sure that I have any great insights other than to say I think the economic conditions are going to continue to be a concern. We'll see businesses having to respond to that as well. We may see more layoff news and other things like that again impact consumer sentiment. Businesses sort of in a sense taking advantage of the current situation to maybe trim in places. That's going to weigh on people's minds while we see segments of the economy continuing to perform quite well overall and consumption reflecting that.
I like lumpy being the theme of this. I just had to say that before we move on. I appreciate those thoughts from both of you. And as always, we will look forward to seeing how those predictions pan out over the next few months. For those of you watching at home, you can see how accurate Rich and Brian are with their predictions when you join us for our next Commerce Pulse Quarterly Roundtable, which takes place in the fall when things will hopefully be a little less lumpy. I want to thank Brian and Rich for their fantastic insights today. To hear more from them, you can find them both on LinkedIn or check out the Bloomreach and IBM websites to learn more about their companies. With that, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again next quarter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Take care.